Did you over rev your ATV and now you've got no compression? Now you think you need a new ATV? Don't be a bitch. Fix it yourself. All the parts and tools I used in this video are in the description below. First things first, we got to remove all the 8 and 10 millimeter bolts holding this valve cover on, as well as the upper motor mount. And the 10 millimeter bolt and copper sealing washers for this oil feed line. Here's a diagram of where all the bolts go because they're almost all unique. Here's our problem. Some yahoo over-revved it and the valve popped out of the keepers. It's pretty bent too. Yeah, cock's stiff. So we'll get the head off, replace that valve, and give her a good all-around lovin'. Remove these 6 fasteners, but don't do it all at once or you'll let evil spirits out. Just crack them loose in a star pattern, just like a 6-lug truck wheel, and don't loosen them all the way. Do it in 3 stages. First, crack them all loose, then go back and do another step. I do it like 3 times, then I run them off. That doesn't sound good. Good Lord. Daddy's not dicking around anymore. Make sure you don't drop these washers. There's another 10 millimeter holding down the oil line. After 37 years, she might be pretty darn stuck, so get yourself a jackhammer. Just kidding. Get a rubber mallet and a piece of dead tree. Gentle love taps all around. Now it should be liberated and you can break it free. But wait, that camshaft has to come out. We'll need to rotate the cam sprocket, so get your flywheel bolt cover tool and remove the cover. Use a 17 millimeter socket to rotate the engine over clockwise, until you see the first 10 millimeter bolt holding the sprocket to the cam. Then the other. Remove the chain tensioner by undoing these 2 8mm. Undo the sprocket bolts. Remove the cam cap for a little extra wiggle room and to make sure you don't damage it when you wrestle the cam out. I find the best way to do this is to rotate the sprocket so its bolt holes are 90 degrees out from the camshafts. Have the camshaft flange pointing vertically like this. Then you can separate the chain from the sprocket and slip it off. Then you can lift out the camshaft and sprocket. There's 2 12 millimeter nuts on each pipe, 4 total. You're supposed to undo this exhaust clamp on the slip joint, but mine is rusted together like an unhappy Catholic marriage, so I'll have to move the pipe as a whole. To get some wiggle room, there's a 12 millimeter exhaust bolt here, and another here. Isn't she lovely? And if you pop off this panel, there's a plate held on by 3 10mm bolts. 2 and 3. Behind that plate, you'll find the third 12mm exhaust bolt. Sit rep. The head is separated, but those exhaust pipes are corrosion welded in. Time for some liquid loving. Finally. Next, the block. Those 6 nuts sandwiched this down, so there's not much holding the block down except these 2 8mm here. And they are tight. Ah! I got paper cut it on the metal head gasket. The sprocket won't fit through the block with the chain installed, so separate those and pull out the sprocket. You might want to put a long zip tie around the timing chain. Makes it easier to fish through the block and head when you are reassembling, if you make it that far. The piston is actually the easiest part. Just take some needle nose pliers and pull out this circlip here. Make sure you don't lose it. Just push the wrist pin through with your finger and the piston comes right out. That's all there is to it. Now that we've got the parts out, time to clean out the crud. Get rid of all old gasket material from that valve cover, the cylinder head, top and bottom, and both sides of the block. Next, I'm going to clean the carbon schmoo using some carb cleaner and my wife's toothbrush. To get the valves out, get an overhead valve spring compressor, or you can stick an oxygen sensor socket onto a cheap Chinese EMC clamp. I welded a bolt to mine. And a magnet to fish out the keepers. I ground out the slot in the socket for a little extra working room. Compress the spring and fish the keepers out with a magnet, assuming they don't fall out. Don't compress it more than you have to. You don't need straight valve stems, but it helps. No need to organize your stuff unless you're an idiot. I'm using a muffin tin. They make a tool to pull valve stem seals, but I just use a bent pick to remove the spring retainer. And then pop it off into orbit. Make sure the valve guides are in great shape. I got one. It's $25 down the drain. There's a tool for hammering these out, but mine's still in the mail, so for now I'm going to use this 3/16 Harbor Freight punch. It's the perfect size. It really helps to heat the head up first, though. No one tell Barb, but I'm using her oven. 275 ought to do it. Hot, hot, hot. Woof. When your new guide shows up, slip an O-ring from the kit onto the new valve guide and chuck it in the freezer. That hit the bottom, didn't it? Lube down your frozen valve guide. This is what's called an interference fit. The valve guide is technically too big to fit in the head, so the hot aluminum expands and the cold valve guide contracts. The Honda punch showed up today and I'm gonna work quick here. And once the head equalizes to room temperature, that guide will be stuck tight. You want to let the head cool slowly. Don't sit it on cold steel workbenches or quench it with water. Aluminum heads warp. Since you bought an OEM Honda valve guide, you'd expect the valve stems to fit through just right. Nothing like genuine parts, right? Wrong. Not even close. The new valve guides need to be reamed to 5.5 millimeters. I got this Chinesium reamer on Amazon for a couple bucks, and it works surprisingly great. Lube her down. Now, how do you know your valves are actually sealing? First, clean them up on the old hemorrhoid remover. Not too shabby. Get yourself some Ottoman purple. Wait, Prussian blue. Yeah, I have no idea where the name comes from either. Lightly coat the valve seats. Just a dab will do ya. And then push the valve closed with your finger. Don't rotate it much at all. Just quick pop it closed, and then open it again to check for poor contact points. Focusing. There. See the bare spots? It means the valve needs to be ground. Once you've identified any issues, wipe out the Prussian blue and wipe some valve grinding compound onto the seats. This is basically liquid sandpaper. Push and hold the valve closed while twisting around at the other end. There's two ways to do this. One, you can grab a drill and some fuel hose. That's the lazy man's method. You really should go slower and use a back and forth action instead of going around and around and around. So I use the fuel hose like I'm starting a fire. Can you hear the sound changing as it cleans up? Much better. This exhaust valve should probably be replaced. I think it has a microscopic bend in it. But it moves freely along its normal operational stroke, and it passes the Prussian blue test. Look, if you saw the turd this head was going on, you'd understand. This is a do as I say, not as I do moment. Get some of this engine rebuilding grease and coat the stems of the valves. Smear it around, and then pop it in. This is the replacement valve I got. Bronco. With a name like that, it's gotta be good. I don't actually know if brand new valves need to be ground first, but I think I'll do a quick Prussian blue test and grind just to be safe. Pull the new valve stem seals out of your gasket kit and pop them on easy as pie. Now we're ready to assemble the valve spring. Starting with the spring seat, the inner spring, the outer spring, and the retainer. Once we compress it, we can install the valve keepers or cotters or whatever you call them. These guys. Compress until the valve stem just sticks out like a crocus in the springtime soil. This is the fun part. Don't do this over a surface where you can easily lose the keepers if you drop them, because that's what you're going to spend most of your time doing. Dropping them. Sorry for the glare off my hand. I have the skin complexion of Nosferatu. Once you get one in, you can release tension a little bit to keep it snug and then use a pick or something and slide it around so the second one goes in more easily. Once it's in, slowly release the spring, but keep an eye on the keepers as you do it, just in case one of them decides to get froggy on you. Do that 3 more times and you're all set. Aren't you glad it's not a V12? I really should replace that valve. Oh well. Next up is the piston. Just clean off the carbon, or don't, I'm not your mother. It's a cheap compression boost. Check out the piston rings. First, check the gap between the top 2 rings and the groove they sit in. It should be less than 1/4 of an inch. I'm American. Those are both in spec. Next, wrestle off those 2 rings and put them inside the block, one at a time, to test the ring gap. You can put the piston in if you want to make sure the rings are perfectly square. I recommend it. As the rings wear, that little gap there gets larger. Both rings should be less than 22 thou. Yep, hot dog down a hallway. Classic. This one's a fail. Time for some rings. I recommend OEM Honda rings, of course, but if you can't find any of those, Wiseco makes a great high compression piston kit. Includes the piston, the rings, the gaskets. I'm running that on my 87 and I love it. These are some low mile used Honda rings I had lying around. Nice and tight. This is how the oil ring comes out. There's a top ring, a bottom ring, and then you can just kind of squeeze, pull the spacer out. Make sure the holes aren't all coked up with carbon. If everything checks out, go ahead and reinstall the oil ring. Put in the spacer first, then the bottom ring. And when you install the top ring, make sure that gap is at least 3/4 of an inch away from the gap in the bottom ring. The second ring has a different profile than the first, and it has to go right side up. Make sure the gap is 120 degrees or 1/3 of the way around from the gap in the top oil ring. The top ring should be another 120 degrees out. Basically, none of the gaps should line up. Now let's look at the cylinder. See those crosshatch marks? That's good, that's what you want to see. But this has some rust marks from sitting, so let's give it a quick hone. These cylinder hones are cheap off Amazon. They fit right in your drill. You want to go really slow so you get nice hatch mark angles as you go in and out. Try to get 1 RPM for every full stroke. And don't stop the drill in the cylinder. Keep it moving as you pull it out. It's not great, but it's not bad. The more consistent your drill RPM, the more even the angles will be. I'm going to yank my chain here and remove the old gasket. This is the gasket kit I used for all these engines, from Tusk. It has the block gasket, head gasket, timing chain tensioner gasket, exhaust ring gaskets, valve stem seals, everything. Stick the piston in and make sure the in faces the rear or intake side of the quad. You can buy piston ring pliers that make this so much easier, but you can get by with some patience and strong fingernails. I take a block of wood and then tap on the piston until the wrist pin can just squeeze in. Don't go too far or your bottom oil ring will pop out and you gotta start all over. See how close that ring is to the bore? Talk about a fine line. Tap in the wrist pin. You don't have to put the pin through the connecting rod, but it helps. Ugh. Starting again. We're not going to install the new exhaust gasket rings until the last minute, but while it's out on the bench, let's pop the old ones out. Reinstall the timing chain guide that most likely came off with the head. Slip the timing chain through the head gasket from the kit, and take note, it is indeed not symmetrical. Feed the timing chain through the cylinder head and make sure all the dowels line up with the head studs. Once you get close, get your cap nuts, washers, and head bolts, and we're going to install them in a star pattern again, torquing them in 2 or 3 stages. I like to run them down till they're seated, then do 15 foot-pounds, and then finish with 30 foot-pounds. Torque specs are not accurate for dry threads. I'm going to put some engine assembly lube on the threads, but any lubricant works really. Once you get it all assembled, tighten down those 2 8mm bolts on the block. I'd say to torque them down to 9 foot-pounds, but I don't know how the hell you're supposed to get a torque wrench on there. Slip the sprocket under the timing chain and wrestle your camshaft in. It's tight, but if you orient the sprocket just right, it will fit. Lift up on the camshaft just enough to squeeze the cam cap in. Probably a good idea to put a little RTV on it so it doesn't leak oil down the road. Rotate the crankshaft over with a 17mm socket until Mr. T lines up with the timing mark, indicating top dead center. Now rotate the camshaft over until both lobes point down and the bolt holes are up and down. Slip some teeth on the timing chain until the holes line up. You should see these 2 hash marks line up with the top of the cylinder head. See what I'm talking about there? You doubted me, but there they are. Once your timing is good, rotate it over and install the 10mm bolts that secure the sprocket to the camshaft. Now we need to release tension on the tensioner and reinstall it. It's a pretty neat little mechanism, just the 8mm cap screw that comes off here, and then insert a slotted screwdriver, and as you turn it, the spring-loaded screw retracts the tensioner. If you let it go, it releases. You're supposed to be able to put a coat hanger or wire pin in there to keep it retracted, but I find it's easiest just to line it up and retract the screwdriver on the engine like this. Then, without letting go of the screwdriver, you can get one of the 2 bolts installed to keep it in place. Don't forget to do the second bolt, and there's a gasket there that I forgot. Since there won't be any oil pressure when you first start this, put some engine assembly lube on both cam lobes and the ends of the camshaft, basically anything that's turning. Just a quick sanity check, top dead center, and my camshaft is lined up perfectly. Put a very thin coating of RTV on the sealing surface of the valve cover. Get your handy dandy diagram and reinstall the bolts. 8 to 10 foot-pounds is all you need. There's no specific torquing order for the bolts, just try to bounce around and get as close to a star pattern as you can. Time to double check the valve adjustment. There should be 0.03 of an inch between the rocker and the valve. To change the clearance, loosen the 10mm jam nut and you can just turn the screw in or out. This snap-on compression tester only reads 120 pissers on this really nice condition Foreman 350, so I know it reads low. Let's see what this old clunker can do. Ooh, that felt good. It's reading 5 psi lower than my Foreman does with the same crappy gauge and a high compression piston, and I'm not even using electric start. There you go, you got your compression back. Now you can put all the other parts back on, and then throw the whole thing away anyway because it's still a piece of junk. Thanks for watching.